Joining us now is Lisa Rubin, MSNBC legal analyst who has been watching this trial from the start, and Rebecca Traister, writer-at-large for New York Magazine. Thank you both for joining me on this very, very big day. Lisa, you've been there through it all. And I gotta say, when you're the lawyer for a defendant and you have to say they didn't get him on the rape thing, that seems like a thin defense given everything else they got him on.
Yes, it is a very thin defense. And he knows what the impact of this liability finding is, because even though it's not a criminal trial, Joe Tacopina in his closing said to the jury, do not condemn this man as a rapist. In other words, he understood full well that while this is a civil trial, the impact of the finding would almost be tantamount to a criminal conviction, even though that's not what it is. It would be a jury of his peers unanimously finding that the conduct itself happened, even if the punishment wasn't jail. The fact that they found unanimously that he sexually abused E. Jean Carroll is astonishing.
You were there, and there was a lot of talk about the composition of the jury, the expectations of this jury. The verdict was handed down so quickly, unanimously. Men outnumbered women.
Yep.
I mean, what can you tell us about what you observed being in the room there, and what were your expectations about how long this was going to take?
My expectations was it was going to take a long time either way, and I'll explain why. If there were people on the jury who didn't want to find for E. Jean Carroll, I thought that there would at least be a few jurors who would, and therefore they would have to hash it out over some series of hours. I also thought that given the number of questions on the verdict form, even if everyone was in agreement, that too would take a while to weigh. What are the quantum of damages that she's owed as compensation, both for the defamation claim and then separately for the sexual assault? What do we owe this woman in terms of punitive damages, which isn't measuring her loss, but how much do we want to punish Donald Trump, right? So I thought these deliberations were going to take a while. When I was sitting down and was told the jury had reached a verdict, my jaw dropped.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to think. But Joe Tacopina got what he wanted, Alex, and it boomeranged on him. Because essentially what he said to the jury, both in his opening and his closing, was everybody has strong feelings about Donald Trump, and that's okay. And there's a place for that, and it's called the ballot box. And when you enter this courtroom, you have an obligation to the rule of law. Well, it looks like even the juror who listened to Tim Pool, by his own admission, that's a far-right MAGA supporting podcaster, he listened
even
to that advice,
guy,
right? He listened. He upheld the rule of law. He put his political opinions at the courthouse door, and he listened to the evidence, and he found where the evidence took him, which was a liability for Donald Trump on both of the counts, both battery and defamation.
Rebecca, we're going to talk a lot today and many days to come about the implications on this as far as Donald Trump and the Republican Party. But what should not be lost here is what this does for victims of sexual assault, what it does in terms of women's narratives and whether and how we believe them. I mean, if you had told me 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that a woman was going to come forward with charges that were decades old, she didn't remember when they happened, she didn't scream, she didn't even really know or understand what had happened to her in the minutes after this assault, I would have said there's no way you can litigate that in court. There is no way. And yet E. Jean Carroll won. How are you feeling about what happened today?
Well, I'm amazed, as Lisa said. I mean, the speed of the decision, the fact that it was unanimous. I mean, it's been a startling day, and I wrote a column last week before the decision, obviously, that was talking about how long these things take, right? The point you just made about how even 10 years ago, something like this would be hard to imagine. One of the things I wrote about in my column is the way that E. Jean Carroll herself focused on her age, and so much that has happened where victories have built on losses and losses have come after victories, and the kind of sinuous and decades-long, lifetimes-long set of changes that have happened around gender and power and the ability for people to tell stories and understand and recontextualize their own experiences. And that's been so much of what we have seen here. And in terms of what you said about about victims, I think it's really important to note this unusual legal circumstance, a civil trial, not a criminal trial. And it happened within this 1-year window that was opened when Kathy Hochul, the governor, signed a law permitting people for whom the statute of limitations on criminal charges had run out to open these civil proceedings. And that law was made possible by victims advocates who worked tirelessly to push for this window to open. All of this came in the wake of what we call the Me Too movement, which sort of crested in the fall of 2017 after the reporting about Harvey Weinstein, but really goes back a year earlier, was the release of the Pussy Tape, in which Donald Trump bragged about being able to grab women against their will. And that was a kind of revelation that caused a storm of other revelations from people who said that they too had been grabbed. And then he won an election after that. There's no straight path here. And that's one of the things that I'm thinking about is just how long this history takes to make, how long social progress takes, and how the path toward progress and towards days like today is very winding. And keep in mind that this is a man who is a candidate for president again. He could very well be the president again. There's no victory that is the end of the story, but there's also no loss that's the end of the story. And that's something that I thought about a lot. Last summer during the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial, there were a lot of sort of funerals for Me Too, as if, it was the end of a story, the end of a period of social progress and movement forward. And this is a lesson for me that we shouldn't be taking the temperature and announcing the ends or the beginnings. We are in a long, generations-long process here. And today is a very big day in that process.
It's such an important... I read the story before the verdict, right? And it almost... I was girding myself like, okay, this is how people are going to process a loss in this trial. But in fact, it ends up being a win, which in some ways also makes the point, just in a slightly different fashion. I think we have... a full screen of the article that you're mentioning, Rebecca, but it is such an important point that progress doesn't happen in a linear fashion. There ebbs and flows. The arc may be long, but it bends up and down and up and down and up and down like a sine curve towards justice. Lisa, the damages awarded to E. Jean Carroll, $5 million. She did not, I did not realize this. I'm going to television law school. You went to actual law school. But I thought, I didn't realize the jury could assign a number to a dollar figure, if you will, to the wrongs that had been done to a plaintiff. Can you talk to me a little bit about how unusual it was for E. Jean Carroll to defer this decision to a jury and to not sort of file for a particular dollar amount? And also whether this sum seems unusually high to you, or, I mean, how do you think of the $5 million price tag?
Well, first of all, I think juries sometimes like to find round numbers and then work backwards to allocate them. One of the things I thought was so unusual here was that E. Jean Carroll's lawyers in their closing made a very big deal of the fact that for her, this wasn't about money. And they did that for two reasons. One, because they were trying to undercut Joe Tacopina's narrative that E. Jean Carroll and her friends, Lisa Birnbach and Carol Martin, conspired to make up a story, first to bring Trump down, then to make money and sell books, and third, to be famous, right? And by saying the amount of money, we're not going to put a price on it. Yes, we're suing for damages, but we're not going to put a price on it. That's up to you. By saying that, they were trying to take the power away from Joe Tacopina's narrative, but they were also saying it because it was true. For E. Jean Carroll, this was principally about getting her name back, getting her reputation back. What surprised me today about the damages was nobody ever said how much in monetary form E. Jean Carroll must have lost through her emotional distress, through her mental anguish, through her fear, through her inability to form relationships with men, which is something that the psychological expert in the case talked a lot about. And yet, the jury assigned $2 million to the assault itself, separate and apart from the reputational losses she suffered when he defamed her. That, to me, was really notable.
You know, where one sort of inflection point on sexual assault may not have resulted in the justice that some victims would like to have seen, which is to say the 2016 election. This one, I feel like I think it's different to be a Republican and to have to find something to say on this.
Well, it's interesting because there are a bunch. First of all, the money matters because we know that Donald Trump hates paying people, right, in general. And so money is something that he uses and throws around in terms of status and power. And he now owes money in a public way, right? I think that actually matters in terms of even his own self-presentation as a powerful man, which has always been tied very closely to his often, I think, exaggerated sense of his own wealth. All right? That matters. I think it also matters, the defamation matters, because one of the things that has been a topic and a real issue for Donald Trump and for the contemporary American right is the weaponizing of untruths, right? Here he has been held legally accountable for defamation, for lying. I think that matters. As to whether it's going to matter, the clips you played from Fox News are really interesting because it is clear that at least in this immediate shock of the moment, there is some distancing happening. I would, however, point to the fact that there was distancing that also happened after the Access Hollywood tape, and we forget that. There were a lot of Republicans who condemned him in the immediate wake of the Access Hollywood tape before it sort of became clear that he was going to barrel forward. So I wouldn't read too much into the political tea leaves about what is this going to mean for his candidacy. I just don't know. I don't know that we can predict that. I definitely agree with you that this matters in many ways. It matters to have this litigated through the legal system, through the process, in a federal case by a jury. All of those are very different from the kind of politicized fighting that takes place on Fox News or, ideologically, and who can be accused of coming from the left or coming from the right. This was a jury, and we know, and, Lisa has talked about this, has been reported. It was mixed ideologically. It was a, majority of men. I think that really does, at least temporarily, and I mean forever, change the nature of how this has been litigated, literally. But I wouldn't make any guesses about how it's going to affect his political future as far as the 2024 election goes. I don't think we can predict that. But there are more legal battles coming. I mean, this sets the stage for what could be many more legal challenges he's about to face.
Yes, I agree with you. It's impossible to know. But regardless of what happens, it matters. It matters for victims. It matters for women. It matters for American culture and society that this happened.